Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tech Uncensored. And my name is Hetty Jones. I'm pleased today to welcome Emily Reid, who is the CEO of AI4All. And this is an organization I've been following for a while, and their mandate is to promote diversity and inclusion within the artificial intelligence sector. So I'm going to throw a couple of stats at you because we've seen AI emerge really quickly within the last 8 years. But what we see consistently is that the male voice still dominates within the sector. In 2018, World Economic Forum actually reported that only 22% of AI professionals globally were female. LinkedIn indicated the same thing. 16% of AI professionals within their platform were women. Also, 12% of researchers worldwide are women. And if we look at the engineering faculty track, the tenure track, 2.6% identify as African American or Black, and only 3.6% identify as Hispanic. So one of the co-founders of AI4All, Fei-Fei Li, is a distinguished computer scientist. She's well known. She's a professor at Stanford. She led the development of ImageNet, which is a large-scale database of labeled images. And this has been really profound and crucial in advancing a lot of the work done for deep learning as well as computer vision. And Fei-Fei Li and her co-founders of AI4All, Olga, Russakovsky, and Sommer, all recognized that there was this substantial gender and racial gap when it came to STEM as well as the AI field. And they recognized that they needed to create opportunities for underrepresented groups to engage with and contribute to the field of artificial intelligence. If you go on the website of AI4All, you'll see these words. AI will change the world. Who will change AI? So I'm excited today to speak to Emily Reid, who is the CEO of AI4All. And she and I are going to address some of these current concerns about AI as it rapidly materializes into our work, our personal lives, and how this organization is actually seeking to influence a more inclusive future. So thank you, Emily, for coming to speak with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hessie, so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So let's start off with you tell me a little bit about yourself, like your interest in this topic, what you have done, and how you ended up at AI4All.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So in terms of my own story, I think one of the fastest ways to describe myself is I'm a computer scientist raised by educators. Both of my parents have been educators their whole lives. They grew up in a really working class background and really kind of used education as a way to bring themselves into the middle class. My father grew up on a farm and became a professor. My mom grew up in a project and became a lifelong elementary school teacher. And I've always looked at education as the way to solve problems. Though initially in my career, I thought I wouldn't go into education at all. It ended up being something that I really kind of couldn't stay away from. I studied math and computer science in college, and that is around when I really started to develop an interest in and concern about the lack of diversity that I was seeing in the spaces that I was in. I was usually one of the only women, maybe one of 2 or 3 women in a lot of my computer science classes. And then eventually when I went into the tech workforce, working as an engineer, I saw the same thing and was also becoming increasingly concerned about what I saw as sort of a lack of ethical frameworks around a lot of the work that we were doing. It felt a bit like kind of the Wild West. There are a lot of other disciplines like law or medicine that have, you can, criticize the structure, but they at least have a structure around and framework around ethical standards. And that's not something that is standardized yet in the AI space. And so For me, I was kind of really becoming concerned by what I saw. I was also experiencing a lot of personal frustration and challenges as one of the only women in the space. And I also knew that I was walking into those rooms with a ton of privilege. And so it just spoke to the fact that this was a really deep problem. Um, and so that was really when I became increasingly interested in how we could be using computer science education to address some of these problems. Kind of what's the root of this issue? I always say to folks, I think computer scientists are problem solvers at their core, and this was the problem I became most interested in. So I ended up going back to graduate school for AI, and I did research and work in computational linguistics, natural language processing, machine learning. But it was during that time I was also kind of going deeper and deeper into computer science education. I ended up joining what was then a small organization called Girls Who Code, was with Girls Who Code through our kind of hyperscaling period and really learned how to scale high impact education programs. I came to AI4All in 2018 to launch our open learning program, which was a program to really take a lot of what we had found as successful in our early high school programs and take it online and bring it into schools directly. During that time, we were also launching our college programs at AI4All. And that was where there was really kind of increasing interest in getting students directly into the workforce. AI was really picking up. And I think what's been interesting, I became CEO about 2 years ago. And what's been interesting during these last 2 years has been seeing this real evolution and kind of resurgence of AI and generative AI. And of course, when ChatGPT, then Gemini, Dolly, like all of these tools came out, they really had such a huge cultural impact. And I think that what's been interesting about being at AI4All through that period is it's a moment that I think our founders really anticipated when they started that original program that you described. They really were. They knew that this moment would come and the society would need to be much more ready than we were. And so I think our mission to create the next generation of AI change makers that the world needs is really focused on the fact that this is a train that has left the station. I understand when folks are really concerned about where AI is going. I think those concerns are valid. I also understand when folks get extremely excited about where it's going and what the opportunities are. And I think that's valid as well. To me, we have a choice about what the future of AI looks like. It's not something that is already set in stone, but it is going to be written by this next generation of AI technologists. And if we don't make some changes now around what the diversity of that cohort of technologists looks like, and if we don't make some changes around what the industry standards around, trustworthiness, human-centered AI, responsibility, ethics, if we don't make some changes there, then I think we're on a really troubling trajectory. So now is the time.
So I think even when AI was starting to emerge, and you and I had this conversation earlier, there was this understanding that there was a diversity gap. And so industry, not only the tech industry, but even outside of tech, and even in the investment side, they started making strides to ensure that there was a lot more representation, a lot more voice or diversity of voice when it came to technology or when it came to actually investing in founders. What have you witnessed recently that seems to have, I don't know, makes it seem that we've taken a couple of steps back since that recognition?
Yeah. No, I love this question, Hissy, because I think it really cuts to the heart of a kind of concerning but also potentially opportune time that we're in. And so, 2022 in particular was an interesting year because when I started out in this role, AI had actually kind of briefly left the headlines for a little while, and everything was about crypto. And we said, kind of what's our kind of position around crypto? That's what like a lot of folks, like students, funders, are asking about. And how do we really make sure that we continue? We know that AI is still going to be pivotal, but it's sort of not the hot topic right now, which I think people forget about in the wake of the generative AI explosion. But there was really that period for a good part of that year. And then we went through towards the end of 2022 tech layoffs, which had an enormous ripple in our industry of computer science education and workforce development, because many of these organizations, AI4All included, work with corporate partnerships as part of our funding models. And it's something that we've really valued, because part of what we want to be able to do is to launch these students into their first roles in AI. So we want to understand what's going on in the workforce, what are folks hiring for? That is a space that is changing much more rapidly than the universities that the students are in. And so we see ourselves as really kind of a bridge between that university experience and the workforce that is so rapidly changing. And so, what we were definitely seeing during that time was there folks that I knew in the tech industry who maybe worked specifically in the DEI space or the corporate social responsibility space, that was really kind of getting more constrained. At the same time, there was, about a month or two later, there were these real enormous booms in investment in AI, and those were the teams that were growing. And I would say that folks who were maybe on like responsible AI teams, that was a little bit in the middle. That wasn't necessarily growing in the same way that like an AI product team was growing. But it was also, AI specific. And so it might have, been retained or prioritized in a way during those tech layoffs. So everything that's going on in the tech industry ends up having a real impact on the nonprofit organizations that are partnered with tech companies. And so, for us, it was an interesting period, because there were constraints with some of the partners that we were speaking to, and there were others who were, excited or coming to us because they wanted to get more involved in AI organizations. I've unfortunately seen over the past couple months some really wonderful organizations like Women Who Code, Girls in Tech Global, need to shut down. And I don't know the details around why that is, but I have to imagine that there's some element of this is sort of this is a really critical issue that I don't want the tech industry to forget about. I think that there was a lot of progress made for a number of years, and the kind of layoff period, I think, has rolled back some of that progress. So my feeling is that we really do have a choice around what the future of AI looks like. We have a choice around what the future of technology looks like. I think I used to really talk about those things separately, but the way that tech has really been developing and AI has been developing is that AI is going to be part of everything. I think Ginny Rometty from IBM said that AI is going to change 100% of jobs, 100% of industries, and 100% of professions. And I don't think that that's hyperbole. There might have been a time where I felt like that was hyperbole, and I no longer feel that way, in part because I've heard some folks liken this, and I think it's a reasonable comparison to liken it to the internet. There were people who said, oh, the internet's going to be a fad in the early 90s, right? And we all know that that didn't end up being the case. In fact, access to internet is really critical for students to even have access to learn about some of these tools, never mind learn how to program them. So that, I think, is that kind of really rapidly changing nature, to me, means that this moment is very critical. It means that if we don't make changes right now, then the status quo of a really homogenous industry that does not have a standard, ethical, responsible framework is going to be the one that we will move forward with as a society, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to change as the years go on. At the same time, I think if we are making a lot of changes now, that will become the model of what the future of AI looks like, because things are changing so rapidly. So I have both a deep concern about where we could go on one path, and a real excitement and sense of hope about where we could go on another.
It's I have the same, and some days it's better than others, but like
Yeah.
on some of the areas where some of these amazing DEI initiatives have failed, like I'll add the one that I know, Fearless Fund, which was specifically started to invest in women of color, women founders in tech, was recently closed down, and it had raised over $25 million. Its closure sent waves through the industry because it was so successful in its raise, but through legal issues, which they could not afford, they unfortunately were unable to continue. But I will say, from an investment perspective, what I'm seeing is that investors, especially when they're starting to look at what generative AI can do, they're increasingly anxious about the technology and not really sure what to trust and what can't be, what to trust and what not to trust. And so they're looking to people who know the tech, to get deeper into it, to even provide some elevated form of technical due diligence in order for investors to be able to say, this is good enough for us. So I think in a lot of ways, in advance of legislation, I think it'll happen, just because investors need to make their money. And if money talks, then this is the way to do it, right?
It's so true. It's so true, Essie, because I think, I think that is, unfortunately, a perfect example of, how it affects the investment and industry side. And it's interesting what you mentioned about regulation, because I felt like that, really a lot of my conversations with partners and advisors in our space in 2023, no question, it was around generative AI, generative AI. We don't want to get left behind. We don't want to kind of miss this boat. Like, how do we use it? I had friends who work in like relatively non-technical industries, like maybe like a might be technical in a different way, but they're not necessarily using AI in their day-to-day. So I had a friend who's works in kind of more of a sales position at like a biomed company, called me to be like, what should our AI strategy be? They were, all of a sudden there was kind of so much focus on, and an anxiety, as you mentioned, around, we don't want to get left behind, and we want to make sure we're taking advantage of this. And then most of those same conversations this past year, or the last 6 to 9 months or so, have been around governance and what does AI governance mean, and how do we make sure to manage these risks in the absence of any kind of real legal framework. And that's something that actually our founder, Dr. Fei-Fei Li, has talked a lot about, that we are, looking at how that might be something that some of our students are interested in, because there is a real lack of, there's a real lack of overlap in the expertise for folks who are in the kind of policy and legal space and the AI space. And there really is a need. I think this has always been the issue with technology legislation, is that it's moving at so much more quickly than the legislation and policy can move. And you have so few folks who are really sitting at the intersection of those two areas of expertise. And so I do hope that we will kind of get to a great framework, but I think it's going to take more folks who have that computer science background working in that space, or maybe advising on that work.
Okay. I want to touch on, when we talk about AI advancement and why diversity is so crucial. And we're at a time right now where we're starting to see some of the impacts of why DEI is actually needed. And so I want you to talk to me a little bit about the anthropomorphization of AI. And it's funny, I actually got through saying that word because it took me a long it became a word that it's so difficult to say, but it is a mainstream term. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about the attribution of human characteristics, whether or not it's emotion, whether or not it's it's gender related, but we're starting to see it a lot more in some of these AI chatbots. And I know it became a little bit of an issue when Siri came onto the market, as well as Alexa and Google Assistant. But I want you to speak to me a little bit about what the implications are from a gender perspective as these AI chatbots start to roll out in massive ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a huge issue, and agreed that while it's a little bit of a mouthful, it's good that anthropomorphization of AI has become a little bit more of a household concept, because I do think that there's a lot of complexity to what the impacts of a really of an AI that seems like it could pass the Turing test. So it would be difficult to tell whether this is really an AI or a human. There's definitely a lot of evidence that users, human beings, prefer interacting with an AI that does seem very human. I think, there's a lot more awareness of the concept of the uncanny valley, the idea that that folks have a really positive reaction to an AI or a robot until it gets almost too human. And if it's kind of just short of being too human, it's really uncanny, and that can be something that then people reject. So there's some interesting ideas around, like, whether you go kind of further along on the spectrum of recognizing it's not an AI or it's not a human being, or whether you really try to make it as human as possible. And part of the challenge with that is it does become confusing. I see I have a 3-year-old daughter. She talks to Siri. I've turned my Siri into a male voice just to mix it up. But I think that it's, she will chat with Siri and try to ask him her questions in ways that, she's aware that it's not a real person, I think. But they are kind of growing up around these technologies as though they may be human beings, or it might be difficult to differentiate which is which. Especially on the gender side, I think it's a really big issue, because they continue to see the vast majority of voice assistants tend to be female coded in some way, whether it be the name and the voice or both. That to me is a really, really big concern, in part because it continues to kind of put women in a position of the kind of stereotype of being a helper, being an assistant. Part of the reason why I know that happens beyond our kind of gender norms in society is that some developers say that folks respond better to a female voice. And that's part of the testing, right? And so that might be a legitimate reason, but what are the other impacts of that? And is that the only thing that we should be valuing? To me, this is the sort of issue that we need to be grappling with in an ethical framework for AI. What are the ethics of that choice? I also think that in addition to it just really reinforcing gender stereotypes, I really believe that it is something that, if we are having a much more inclusive industry, it's certainly not on the shoulders of the one female engineer in the room to kind of raise this as an issue. But as we have a much more, if we are moving towards a more inclusive, more diverse industry, I think we're going to have much more nuanced conversations around what this could look like, what our default assistant voice should be, what kind of options are available to change that, and being able to properly evaluate what the risks and harms are. We don't really have developed standard frameworks for that at this point. And again, I think that if we don't change that soon, we're going to be in a world where voice assistant and female voice seem synonymous.
Yeah. I wanted to add to that because like there are a lot more emotionally supportive chatbots.
Yeah.
I actually tried one. It's called My Pi, and it's supposed to act as a coach and a confidant. And sometimes I ask it questions like, how do I deal with this person who is highly sensitive or who is an intern? And I really want to convey this message, but I want to do it in a way that's non-confrontational. And it is eerily effective in its advice. So I think that, so it brings up a couple of questions, which I want you to address. It's one thing about dependence, but then the second thing, which you kind of covered in the last statement you made, but about the legalities when it comes to the advice that's given and who's going to be liable,
Right.
if somebody takes that advice to heart.
Yeah, it's a really, really rich example, because I think there's a number of issues that it brings up. Kind of first, that point about kind of going backwards here. One of the last things you mentioned around the like what's going to be shared, who's liable. I started out my career actually in cybersecurity and got into machine learning through that process, and so I'm always looking at all of these models with a frame around what should have been the sort of privacy restriction on the data that was used to train this model. And as we're continuing to feed more data into models, how much kind of personal information or company information might we be giving up? How is that being used? I think that's a huge issue that companies and individuals are grappling with. But at the same time, another example of this type of bot is there was a story recently about one of these kind of emotional support chatbots that are being used with more lonely adults. And we know that loneliness for older generations is a really, really huge mental health problem. And so I think, to me, there are some real difficult questions there. One is, I think the sort of negative reaction, visceral reaction that folks have to something like that comes from the place of like, we don't want this to be a Band-Aid. But at the same time, the current state of affairs is also not working. And so is it going to be the case that maybe having more of those emotional support chatbots available to folks is going to actually help them, at least in the short term? But then it also runs the risk of being a Band-Aid to a problem, and not really actually treating the deeper disease, right? Like kind of just treating the symptom, not the disease. And so I think it brings up some really challenging questions, because I think it's concerning to folks to really kind of put these put some of this emotional labor in, if you will, into AIs. But at the same time, it might actually, compared to the world as it is today without it, it might actually help some people. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is really how do we navigate that part? What you mentioned about the Pi chatbot, I think, is a really great example, because it brings up, okay, it is kind of maybe giving advice that you could imagine a world where this is more veering on the could be something that like therapists are using, right? Like there's one thing that you might be using in conversation with your team, and then there's the kind of another deeper level of what, say a therapist might be using. And on one hand, I think that it does bring up a lot of issues around, like, are we now outsourcing that kind of real human emotional work to an AI that I think that all of these bring up real questions and anxieties about what it means to be human. And so I think that that's one part of it. But again, at the same time, is it knowing how influential these technologies are, would it be better to have an AI chatbot that is not emotionally intelligent at all? And what would that look like, right? And so I think these, to me, again, these are the really kind of thorny, challenging issues to which there's no real easy answers to. My belief, and this is really why we do this work at AI4All, is that I have, I always say to folks, I have my own ideas around what I think we should do as an industry and what I think needs to change. But ultimately, I really believe that what is going to make the biggest difference and really help us head in the right direction and answer these really thorny issues is when we have a large, diverse, ethically trained generation of AI technologists who are bringing their own areas of expertise, bringing their own life experiences, bringing those perspectives into the conversation and feel empowered to do so, are in positions where people will actually listen to what they say. We have this, we call the Future Forum dinner series. We have these kind of salon style dinners with advisors and partners and some of our staff, as well as our students. And we bring up a big issue around, what the future of AI is going to look like. As we're having generative AI and Gen Z really intersect, what's that going to look like? And I've been in conversations where folks are talking about Gen Z and STEM education, and I've raised my hand and said, this is a great conversation, but there's no one from Gen Z in the room. What do they think? And so we make sure to bring our students into the conversation and keep their perspectives at the same level as some of our, C-level partners at top AI companies, because to me, their opinions are just as valid. And I'm a really huge believer in that kind of, if you will, collective intelligence of our real human network coming together on these issues. Because that question of, is emotional intelligence being built into a chatbot positive or negative? It's a really thorny question without a clear answer right now, but I think that's the way that we're going to be able to get to better answers.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the thing that's really hard about AI, and I think for people that have developed software, they know that you don't ship something that doesn't 100% work. AI is a different beast because it trains and it gets better, but it has to train on real data in order to get better. So you can't kind of keep it locked in the box and assume that you can keep feeding it other data to get better. It's the unfortunate part of being a different technology than normal software, right?
Right.
So I want to get into, because you're talking about students, and I want to switch a little bit to education, because there was a recent article about a company called All Here, and they were an educational platform that was, I think they were hired by the Los Angeles Unified School District to actually build a $6 million AI chatbot called Ed to help both students and parents navigate a lot of the educational resources and supplement some of the classroom instruction. So from the optics perspective, it looks like this is a really, really good thing. Not only will it help the students, it'll help kind of get the teachers moving to a better level of instruction and help, reduce their, being overwhelmed, not only within the classroom, which they have been for years, but also be kind of like the catalyst to actually enable a new type of instruction to get their kids moving in the direction that we want them to go. So apparently it failed. And so the founder left, as well as the employees, which they furloughed. I want you to speak to this idea of education and AI in the classroom, and situations like this that have been trying to appeal to bringing not only like the technology, but also the new wave of how we do things into the education system, which we know has far been, I guess it's archaic.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it, because there is a it's so difficult for some of these really large institutions to change, and there's certainly some reasons why we maybe want to be thoughtful and methodical in that process. But there's also times when it can just really kind of create a really challenging environment for innovation. And I do think that the way that I think about change and innovation is around opportunity. I think it's in those moments of change and innovation, and when things are kind of shifting, the ground feels like the ground's shifting underneath you. That's actually when I think we have the most opportunity to change systems for the better, because it's really hard to change systems when they are really firm and immovable objects. And so there is, when I heard about this story, there's a couple different things that came up for me. One, in terms of what sounded like a relatively ambitious project for this newer organization. From what I knew about the story, it did read to me a bit as something that was maybe kind of a victim of the hype cycle of AI. We know that technology goes through these hype cycles. There are periods when we get really hot on a particular technology, and AI has gone through this a number of times. And then we go through an AI winter where some of those ideas don't necessarily bear out, and there ends up being a lack of investment in both the private sector and public sector. So I think that kind of like both the business investment and the like scientific investment and kind of R&D in those different technologies, it goes through these cycles. And to me, it read a little bit as something that there probably was a lot of hype and excitement that then really overshot what was possible to do in that period of time. And, that I think is going to create a lot of challenges for a lot of these AI companies. Of course, we're going to go through kind of these, boom and bust cycles. But the thing that worries me the most is kind of who gets lost in that process. I do believe that over time, technological innovation tends to actually create more jobs than it gets rid of, but it does get rid of jobs, and there is a lot of reshuffling in the short term. And it's the folks who are more marginalized in society that are going to experience the worst of that. And they may not necessarily be trained up or have the social safety net that they need to manage those periods where the jobs are shifting around. So those are a couple of the things that come up for me on the industry side when I read that story. But also thinking about the education side, I am a huge believer in the need for AI literacy. And by that, I don't just mean students being able to being competent in using AI tools. I think that that's something that this generation, as long as they have access to the internet, which can be its own question, but if they have access to the internet, they're going to have access to these tools, and they're going to become more expert on them than I am. So that part, I believe that they'll be competent users really quickly as long as they have internet access. That's not necessarily the same as being able to understand what is really underneath the machines and what is really inside of these algorithms, and being able to be real kind of informed citizens or informed users of these technologies. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to be teaching machine learning to kindergartners, but I think that there is actually a way for us to teach the fundamentals of artificial intelligence in a way that is not dumbing it down, is really honest about what the technologies are, what the risks and benefits are, and allow for an educational system that is helping students to, at a minimum, become real informed users of these technologies and understand a little bit more what's happening behind the scenes. I think in sort of pre-AI world, I compared this, or kind of pre-AI focus, and thinking about computer science more broadly, I had compared this to, you know, the kind of Mavis speaking typing classes and Math Blaster that I did in my computer class in elementary school, as opposed to learning how to program. Right. And those are two really different things. We can be users of technology, great, but how do we actually become the creators of it, or be able to be informed enough to influence it? So to me, that all starts with AI literacy. You don't necessarily need everyone to become a machine learning engineer, but even getting a more diverse group of machine learning engineers is going to have to start with more AI literacy. Because if you don't even have that kind of point A for students, you end up having more, and I, you know, have seen this so much working across the high school to college to early career space, is that if you don't have really broad AI literacy, really broad computer science education, then what happens is that the students who end up studying that in college, maybe you only get the students who were the top math and science students, or you get a lot more students whose parents were already in the industry and have been around it at home. And so in order to really make that a much more diverse space, we have to be able to start at more of a level playing field. And so it brings up a lot of those challenges when I read this story, is both, you know, that kind of like hype cycle and what that's going to mean in the industry space, but also what the role of AI tools in education is going to look like.
It's funny that you're saying that, because I was going to ask you a question about the importance of STEM, but then I'm starting to realize that the way you're talking, it's not really forcing people into STEM, but creating a foundation at the very beginning where they're understanding the technology and what are the intricacies of it. You may not necessarily be good in math. You may not necessarily be good in science, but at least know enough about the fundamentals of the technologies that you're using to apply more, I guess, a critical thinking perspective. And so if you think about it, and maybe this is something that you could also discuss, like there is an importance of still going into social sciences, still going into the humanities and arts. So how does that all integrate? As, let's say, if I decided, like, I like AI, I like to use it as a user, I understand that it's important in how I navigate all my daily stuff, but you know, I want to be an artist. You know, I want to help people in social science. So from that perspective, you're saying it's not going to limit you if you apply some of the stuff that you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important example, because I think that in the computer science space, for example, a lot of the kind of workforce development and CS education work has been focused on, there is like one piece around AI literacy, but then we're talking more about how we're developing programmers, computer scientists, machine learning engineers, software engineers. To me, AI is really upending that entire system. And I'll give a couple examples of why I think that's true. And I think folks have talked about STEM education for a long time. And frankly, I've always had trouble with that particular acronym, because I think that it actually ends up kind of obscuring what we're talking about. It was often used kind of interchangeably with computer science, but actually none of those things, math, science, technology, engineering, or math, are exactly the same thing as computer science. So, right. So it really kind of obscures, I think, can run that risk. And now even seeing kind of computer science space versus AI space, there are things that are really different and unique about AI. That's one of the things that really brought me into this particular organization when I first joined, because there was a sense of while AI could certainly be viewed as a subdiscipline of computer science, there are some real kind of unique qualities around AI that are different, and that I think really end up being highlighted when we're talking about the practical impacts in education and workforce. So one example. During those tech layoffs we talked about, in addition to having, friends who worked in the DEI space at tech companies, experiencing layoffs, I also had friends who were software engineers who were getting laid off. And not just because the company was potentially shrinking, but also because, as in the sort of later phases of that, as more generative AI tools were coming out, it was actually replacing software engineers in some cases. Our conversation around job replacement and AI years ago was more focused on concern around blue collar jobs. And what we're seeing now with generative AI is there is a displacement in white collar work, for lawyers, for content creators, for graphic artists, and for computer scientists and software engineers. If I think in that sort of asterisk I'll put there is if they don't have a AI skill set that they can actually continue to apply in their work. So when we think about AI education space, while the computer science world is changing and shifting, I think there were the kind of concept for a lot of the early computer science organizations, education organizations, was that, okay, having a degree in computer science will give you kind of a ticket to a great career path. And again, I think that is true when you put the asterisk on it, that it's including AI skills. But at the same time, computational thinking has actually become more important for everyone in every industry. Because every time, what generative AI in particular has done is it's turned all of us into programmers. We're just programming in natural language. So when you go to, ChatGPT, or you go to Gemini, and you're creating something, I'll have friends who describe, okay, maybe they want to, there's some content for social media that they're creating, or there's some sort of image they want to create. They have to go through a number of iterations, and they have to give it feedback, and they have to test it and run it again. And I say, oh, yeah, you're debugging your code. Your code's just in English or natural language of choice, right? And so I think that it has really, in computer science, we talk about the kind of layers of abstraction. It's allowed us to now, we were once really programming practically in binary, and then we built compilers, and then we had things like Python, and we kind of went further and further up, and now we can program in our natural languages. So that kind of that is really a shift in all roles. And I really I sometimes hesitate around this because I don't want to slip into the kind of hype side. But that quote from Janira Mehdi around this is going to change 100% of jobs, I think there's really, really something to that. Because one of the examples that folks have given, and I think it is a pretty valid comparison, is this kind of generative AI in particular explosion, going to be similar to the onset of the internet and broad access to the internet. And there were folks in the early 90s who were saying, oh, the internet thing is a fad, and we're gonna kind of come back to how we used to do business. And obviously that wasn't true. And I think that it's possible that AI is, if not to that level, certainly within that order of magnitude. So to me, that creates an environment where, yes, artists, lawyers, social scientists. I know a lot of folks who work in computational social science and have been, the lab that I actually worked at in grad school was really focused in that space. And you have folks who are social scientists and machine learning engineers coming together and working on some really interesting problems. And so I think it's going to become more of just a way that we all work. And so that being able to bring that AI expertise into other spaces is a really different story than years past, where this was something that, only really lived in the most advanced labs and some of the top research institutions. It's going to be something that we all are touching in some way, regardless of what role we may be in.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I mean, when we talk about AI and potential displacement, now you didn't say that Ginny Rometty said that people would be displaced. You said that AI will change everything. And I listen to a lot of artists, and I listen to a lot of writers who are afraid that AI is going to get good enough that they don't need me. But I said, writers and people who have a specific craft have an advantage over others who don't, in that they may be able to use their natural language programming to up level their skill. So they may not necessarily write from scratch, but they will become super editors, and they will go faster than those who haven't written like a stitch of an article in their whole life, right? It's the same with artists. Maybe it'll elevate everyone to a new level that they've never hit before, because it brings on a new type of efficiency and obviously a new type of adaptability.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that there's I guess one of my real kind of core philosophies around technology is that it should be, we should be looking at it as a tool and as a means to an end, and not the end in and of itself. And I think that's one of the things that the philosophy that I think tends to prevail in a lot of Silicon Valley companies and tech world is, the technology as this end goal and advancing this technology. And I think that's where, to me, some of the personally, my opinion is that like the obsession with AGI is incredibly displaced. To me, this really should all be around, this is a tool for what the goals that we have as a society, as communities, as individuals. These are tools, really wonderful tools that we can use if only we have access to them, and if only they are being developed by a relatively representative group of people. I agree. I think there's a lot of potential for innovation in those other spaces. And I will say I have friends who say are graphic artists and are really concerned because some of the work that they would be paid to do previously, I can do in DALL-E, or maybe not as good a version, but I can do a quick version in DALL-E in a couple seconds, right? And that does cause a real issue for them in the short term. But I agree. I think because we sometimes get into this mindset of thinking about the technology as the end goal, we miss some opportunities around, well, maybe this is really just something that's more assistive. There might be some areas where this is, the real end goal. But, I've heard a lot of folks talk about it as it really creates getting rid of the sort of blank page problem as a writer, if you need to write a report of some sort. Within all of the ethical frameworks of whether you're doing that in a company or a school. But I think it does really remove a little bit of that kind of rough draft, kind of first pass blank page issue, because it gets us started with something. And as you said, you can then be editing, you can then be in kind of a different role. I think that I was really interested when, SAG went on strike and actors and writers went on strike. And I think that there's some really interesting stories and lessons there of how, the human beings at risk right now can really use some of their own collective bargaining power to really force industry to come up with processes, policies that are going to be more fair. Because I do think that there is a real benefit to using AI in particular areas, but we don't want it to be at the risk of some of that real human creativity, especially when a lot of the AI creativity has been trained on those artists, right? It's a lot of the tech, there's been a lot of stories around that, but I could go into one of the image generation tools and say, develop a you know, a new logo for AI4All in this artist style, right? And some tools will kind of say, oh, we can't do that, and others will just go ahead and create it, and there's no real kind of strict framework. And so all of those, all of that kind of human creativity, some of which artists kind of either gave up, you know, may have kind of given up for free. Those tools have been trained on and are charging others for. So I think we really need more more activity, and we really need those voices to be heard in order for us to figure out what are the economic frameworks that are going to be fair here, given that there is the kind of value that artists have already created, that they're not getting the benefit from for some of these paid tools in particular.
I agree with you. It seems like we're at an inflection point where, you know, government, you know, policy, artists, everyone, this is an interdisciplinary problem that we need to solve. Yeah. Because it'll hit all of us at some point in time. Somebody told me, you know, maybe AI is the biggest equalizer, and that it will do everything better than the normal human being. And so we bring in universal basic income. And I said, you know, I do not want that to be a default, even though it may be true. At some point in time, there will be jobs that will be displaced, and you cannot replace them unless they upskill themselves. That has to be done. But I apologize. I actually want to talk to you for another hour, 2 hours, but I can't because we have a few minutes to go.
Me too, Essie.
But thank you so much, Emily, for coming, and I look forward to more discussions like this as you know, AI develops further. I want to see what kind of milestones that AI4All is actually making in the coming years.
Thank you so much. And I'll just one last note that I'll leave our conversation on. This has been wonderful. Thank you again. I know we went. I could keep going too. So we'll have to do it again another time. But what you just mentioned there, you know, I had a conversation with a colleague who works in one of the major generative AI companies, and he was making an argument that this is kind of potentially a great equalizer, creating a level playing field. And again, I think this is a good place to use that argument around the internet, or that comparison to the internet is that was a bit of an argument at the time for the internet as well, that it was going to be really a great equalizer. It was going to kind of create access. Today, there are still folks who don't have internet access. And the other thing that happens is that sort of those early days of the internet, it was much more of the Wild West, and there were those bulletin boards, and there was, you know, a really kind of different kind of environment. And then you have, you know, more companies getting into the space, economic consolidation happening. And now the internet is really influenced by, like 90% of it is influenced by 4 or 5 companies. So that, to me, I think that what technologies like this do is they create the opportunity for that to be the case. But they are ultimately going to end up working within the other systems that we have, the other political systems, the social systems, all of those systems that we live in as human beings. It's going to adapt to that unless we are thoughtful and strategic and really kind of active and hopeful about what we can change there and how we can use the opportunity with these technologies to change some of those systems. So again, I think that there is a lot of hope for where we can have AI go, but so much of it is going to be dependent on what we choose to do. So thank you, Hessie.
Thank you so much. I have hope for the next generation. So I tell my kids this all the time: you guys are going to change the world. And I hope it allows us all to live a happier life, right? These days, it's hard to question that. Anyway, thank you again. So for our audience, thank you for joining us today. If you have topics that you want us to cover, please email us at communications@accelerator.ca. Tech Uncensored is produced and powered by Altitude Accelerator. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. My name is Hessie Jones, and until next time, have fun and stay safe.